Daarna komt een link. I think I see a few new faces here, so that's terrific. Welcome. So we are discussing the book, A Fearless Heart by Thupten Jinpa. And we are pretty much finished with the chapter on self-compassion or self-acceptance. But this theme carries through to the remainder of the book. And so we will be coming back to Thupten Jinpa's presentation. And it's very, very interesting. In fact, I have to admit, as I was driving over here, you know, I usually teach more sort of traditional Tibetan Buddhism. So for me, this is kind of a stretch. I'm not a therapist. I've never been to therapy. So I'm actually totally unqualified. The only reason I thought this was very interesting. And I think as a human being, then I have some human being who's been on the planet for a while. I might have some life experience to be able to use to relate to what Jinpa has presented so skillfully. And I hope that you also will enjoy reading this text. So particularly, you know, if you have insights based on our class discussions, or if you are reading the book at home and there's something that you would like to bring up, that I encourage you to contribute to our class. You know, this is very much more just sort of a discussion and a way of bouncing ideas off of one another to help us understand the thoughts and to be able to really engage in some transformation of the way in which we usually make it through the day. So for those of you who may not have been here before, so usually the way the class is presented, you know, we do a short meditation, and then we do like a class. I'll do a little bit of a presentation based on the books that we're reading. And then we usually do some kind of a class exercise or meditation. And that's pretty much it. So the other book that we're using is the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook by Drs. Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer, both of whom have also written their own books that go along with the workbook, or vice versa. So the exercises that we'll be doing are both in Thupten Jinpa's book as well as Kristen Neff. So let's just take a minute to set our motivation for being here. So just sit comfortably and think, I could be sitting at home enjoying a cup of coffee at the dining table. But no, I would come out on a cold day, driven a fair distance to come here. And why have I done that? Why is coming here important to me? What do I hope to achieve? Is it to help address a particular trouble that you might be working through? Or is it a more general wish for cultivating self-awareness and peace. Sit with your back straight and your palms, either if you're in your chair, you could put them on your knees, or you could put them in your lap, whatever's most comfortable for you. You have the right hand cradled in the left hand. Keep your shoulders down and back in an open, relaxed position. Your eyes can be gazing at the floor ahead of you, or you can close your eyes. Feeling safe, protected, and loved. Letting go of all concerns about the past and expectations of the future. Just abiding in the present moment. Bringing your attention to the breath. You can breathe in with your whole body. On the inhalation, just think that the whole body is breathing at the same time. Bringing in that clean, fresh energy. On the exhalation, releasing all that tension and anxiety, all that negative, stale energy. Let your body soften and relax with the rhythm of the breath. And relax your attention on the breath and just sit. Just be who you are, where you are. Here and now. And then bring your attention back to the sounds in the room, the fragrance of the incense. And when you're ready, open your eyes. I was actually in Nyack, New York, at a different center yesterday. And there were only 3 of us doing this meditation. And the heat was on, and it was really loud. So it was kind of funny because I would say something, and then I had to time what I was talking about to the sound of the heat. And it seemed very dramatic because I would say something, and then he would go, ah. So like it took you into this other zone, you know, like this deep sleep, right? This deep sleep state. And you go, oh. like I just said, like here and now, and I'm like, I could just imagine the big heater turned on. Oh, really got to focus now. The heat. I'd say something else. The heat. It was actually very helpful. Okay, so anyway, talking about, I thought this was really interesting. Acceptance. So we were on, for everybody who's reading the book, we're on page 60, letting go of resistance. And this is in the chapter 3. We're just finishing up chapter 3, From Fear to Courage is the title of the chapter. And in Kristen Neff's book, it's the chapter 7 on page 50, letting go of resistance. So we're talking about acceptance and how it relates to suffering and resistance. And so the chapter up to this point, we've been talking about compassion and the meaning of compassion for others, as that also relates to self-acceptance and self-compassion. And we talked about some of the things that we find that inhibit the ability to generate compassion. Specifically, we were talking about fear, right? Some of the things that in our lives that naturally cause us to be afraid of opening up to compassion. So some of the barriers to compassion. We talked about things that cause us to fear generating compassion for other people, the fear of receiving compassion from others, and finally, the fear of having compassion for oneself. And so there are several different aspects associated with those different kinds of fear. This relates to the idea of resistance. So resistance to compassion is not just associated with fear, but other types of barriers that can prevent compassion from developing include, and these all relate back to the idea of a sense of self, right? Sense of ego, our innate tendency to hold on to ourselves. And so fear, as it relates to protecting the self, keeping the self number one, that's closely related to defensiveness, right? So if you're feeling fearful, that can be related to the idea of protecting yourself, which can be related to the idea of, as I said earlier, of the self, the sense of pride, right? Protecting your sense of who you think you are, as well as trying to protect ourselves from feeling the pain associated with, for example, we think of what's going on in Australia now. It's painful to watch the videos of the bushfires and the fires impact on all those koalas and wallabies and kangaroos and the like, right? So oftentimes, it's easier to just click off or not look, right? Especially when you're looking at it as graphic image, right? I never look. This is too, so that's a attempt to protect myself from pain, from seeing the suffering of others, from disturbing my own sense of peace, right? So the main point here, though, is that resistance, that kind of resistance, that closing the door to compassion, closing the door to being more open to our own feelings, as well as open to what's going on around us, that actually leads to further suffering. It actually makes the situation worse instead of better. So that's what we're talking about now. So what does it mean to practice? And I think it's meant in a very intentional way to cultivate the good habit of being able to assess the situation realistically and then accept what's going on. And so Neff writes, she wrote, acceptance means instead of our usual reaction of getting upset or depressed, trying instead to look at the situation using reason and compassion, and recognizing that an emotional reaction will only make the situation worse, right? So the key words here are using reason and compassion, and recognizing that an emotional reaction will only make the situation worse. So here, when she mentions compassion, again, as we had talked about a little bit earlier, compassion doesn't mean that kind of sentimental ooey gooey, right? It's not that sentimentality, but rather it's that even keeled, it's still an emotion, right? But it's not mixed with attachment, right? So it's trying to look at the situation using reason and compassion. Compassion, really meaning the wish to be able to alleviate the suffering of the koala bear or the homeless person or the person who's deeply depressed, right? So it's compassion in the sense of wishing to personally be able to do something, and accepting, our own limitations. Right? So suffering, she says, I thought this was a good way of thinking about this. Suffering can be understood as pain times resistance, right? So this is kind of like the opposite of accepting a situation. We cause suffering, right? We have the choice whether or not to skillfully accept a situation or whether we want to, in a sense, cause a situation to provoke suffering, right? How much suffering an experience causes us is the result of conscious, choices that we make. So suffering, so any situation can be associated with some degree of pain, right? So if you touch a hot stove, right, there's going to be physical pain. If you lose your job, there's going to be, of course, a certain amount of pain. But to the extent that you multiply that pain by resistance to that situation, right, then, and resistance meaning what we were just talking about, I think, that these different types of resistance. So fear, defensiveness, pride, all coming back to that idea of pride, right? Then the extent to which we put up this resistance magnifies the pain and results in suffering, right? So that's what, and then associated with this idea is that to the extent to which we magnify or aggravate pain by putting up resistance, causing suffering, the more we resist, right, the more suffering that's generated, and that type of suffering, because it's pushed and aggravated by the suffering, that it tends to last on and on and on and on. Right? It's like fanning the flames of the fire. Okay. So she writes, in other words, pain in life, such as loss, worry, heartbreak, hardship, all of that is inevitable. But when we resist the pain, it usually just makes the pain more intense. We suffer not only because it's painful in the moment, right, but because we bang our head against the wall of reality getting frustrated because we think things should be other than they are. So it's not just thinking, okay, so two aspects there, right? So we suffer not only because it's painful in the moment, we think that things should be other than the way they are, so we're not being able to accept, you know, a particular situation. It's not going, things aren't going the way we think they should go, right? So our expectations are not being met. And then I think the third aspect is to continue pushing, continue to you know, maybe talk about the situation with other people, to continue ruminating over and over and over again in our minds, not being able to let go of the situation, right? And as a result of that, it becomes bigger and bigger. Yeah. Another opposite way in which we can resist a situation, though, is denial. So we think that if we don't think about a problem, if we just completely pretend that it doesn't exist, right? We just keep turning away from it. We think that maybe it'll just go away. I think I do that all the time. But research shows that when we try to suppress our unwanted thoughts or feelings, however, they just get stronger, right? So this is actually more dangerous, or equally dangerous, right? So if we keep stuffing things into pushing them down, 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 eventually some trigger is going to ignite, you know, that fire, those suppressed you know, coals, and they will roar back into life. Okay. So you can probably tell that I have a wood stove, and all I've been doing recently is trying to keep this wood stove going. So all my analogies will be wood stove oriented. I apologize for that. So I was thinking that, you know, resistance, what does resistance mean to you? I think it has many different aspects. Resistance to things that we like, as well as resistance to things that we don't like.
For me, I think of it almost as avoidance. I think
Yeah.
resistance comes in terms of trying to avoid the reality of the situation.
Okay.
But, you know, it could be as simple as acknowledging that I'm having a really stressful week, and my immediate response is to try to control it all, which just makes it worse, because then it becomes even more stressful, because no matter how hard I try to control something, I do not have control of it.
Right, right.
And instead of just kind of coasting along and accepting it. And it comes in so many different aspects.
Yeah.
But I think it's trying to avoid the chaos of, you know, I'm a teacher. It's chaos all the time. Trying to avoid chaos.
A lot of variables.
Yeah, constantly. So I try to avoid the chaos. And if it's starting to feel a little chaotic, or if I am, I resist it by trying to put more parameters and controls, and which
run faster, juggle faster.
Yeah, and then it makes me more stressed.
Sure.
And that makes my class more stressed, and then chaos just blossoms in that kind of environment. So yeah, I think it's less about, for me, I can't think of it so much as resisting it as trying to sort of skirt around it or control it or avoid it or just whatever I can to make it not so.
Okay. Yeah, great. And your name is?
I'm Jody.
Jody.
Yes. I have a little bit more of a question. I understand, and I actually struggle with that as well, that type of resistance. But where I get confused is, are there some times where you should be resistant, you know, when you are, and that's where I get caught up, I think. So I'm not sure how to decide.
Okay. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of thinking of, I can't think of a specific right now. It'll come to me, but you know, if there is something, so just the Women's March, that's a lot of resistance, but the Women's March brings a lot of good. So that would be an example.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, and that's actually in the exercise that we're going to do a little bit later, exploring situations where.
You can wait.
No. Would anybody like to comment or share a little bit more about?
I think that if you really look at resistance, personal resistance, don't you think it comes really from attachment? Attachment of yourself, attachment of what you think should be,
Yeah.
attachment of your goals. Like I've done an action, and if it didn't come out the way I wanted it to, then why did I do it? You know, and if you can let go of the
Frustration.
attachment, then a lot of it's just, like you said, expectations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or maybe it's like, it can be inertia too. Because I was thinking about this, like resistance to getting started, even if it's something that you want to do. But sometimes that initial, maybe it's just, I was talking to this, actually, I have a son, a 19-year-old son, and he wants to play the guitar. So he said, I want to play my guitar. I really like to play the guitar, but I have to lower the barrier to make it really easy to be able to pick up the guitar to play it. Because if there's anything in the way, like, oh, I have to get up, take the guitar out of the case, set it up, then I guess that must be just like lazy, right? Like, why? If you really want to do it, dude, it shouldn't be such a problem. But that was, and he read this in the book, all about resistance, or even just like, he's a photographer and film guy, right? So he has to spend a lot of time editing. He loves to edit, but he said, getting the computer set up, this is okay, you're lazy. No, I don't know. It's some kind of resistance. Okay, so Yvonne's here. She's a real therapist, so she's gonna keep me in line.
Well, I just want to say, recent research that we used to frame that kind of resistance in terms of poor time management.
Okay,
Actually,
yeah.
that's not the case.
Huh.
And the case really is some emotional obstacles, blocks, which goes back to the first, what Ron was saying, right? But the emotions get in the way. And it's fear I'm not good enough, fear it's not going to be perfect, fear it's not going to turn out the way I think it should.
Okay.
Those are really the things that look like resistance, but it's actually based in emotional obstacle.
Perfect. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Steve?
I think that's, I look at it as it's pretty simple. It's just a posture and an attitude that's just very close-minded.
Close-minded, is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay.
It could be to anything, to any type of change or discomfort or event. If I just dismiss it, then don't even entertain whether there's any benefit to it or, look beyond the event. Just forget about it. I'm not interested in that. It's like an instantaneous
Okay.
posture that I take to resist whatever it may be. Nope.
Nope. Out of there.
It's pretty cut and dry.
Okay.
Very close-minded.
But
Resistance, I think, there's different steps. It's like I can get to the step of seeing that there's inertia.
yeah.
And then there's this inner war that comes on.
Yeah.
Okay, where are you headed? You break down this wall, then what? And fear of the expectations that this other place said, well, can you do it? Can't you do it? And
Right.
going back and forth, but that's what you should do.
Right.
And
Right.
then you should, but I don't want to do all those shoulds. Don't
Yeah.
should on me. And goes back and forth, and sometimes resting, sometimes bringing in all that you've learned about Buddhism and all these other places, and that makes sense, but we can laugh at it and think,
It's
oh,
still
isn't it
there.
silly that we're doing all this, but then you go home alone, it seems serious. Suddenly the war
Yeah.
goes back on.
Yeah. All right. So So I think one of the things that we touched on was getting back to this idea of change, right? Of impermanence, right? The truth of impermanence, the fact that we live in chaos is due to and that we want to control things, and yet we can't control things because the nature of reality as we experience it is one of continuous change, right? And so impermanence is one of the main thoughts in Buddhism. And so constantly being able to, trying to make sense of things in a world that's constantly changing is something that we need to practice acceptance and letting go and all of that. Being able to accept that our limitations and what we can and can't, right? So then, I don't know, I think we might have talked about this last time, but mindfulness and self-compassion are resources that give us the safety needed to meet difficult experiences with less resistance. So how can we lower our resistance to difficult experiences? Well, we can use mindfulness and self-compassion. What's the difference between the two? Mindfulness is primarily centered around the acceptance of the experience. So being able to, take a step back and watch and accept the experience. And then self-compassion, she writes, or they write, is the feeling that you generate with respect to yourself. Right? That makes sense. Mindfulness is when you're accepting the experience. Self-compassion is directed towards the self. Mindfulness is the tool that you use to say, what am I experiencing right now? Self-compassion asks the question, what do I need right now? So it kind of takes the perspective of assessing, your own needs and soft spots, I think, your vulnerabilities. Mindfulness is the question, how can I, it's not a question, it's the ability, the capacity to feel your suffering with spacious awareness. So that's the perspective that you would turn to be able to change your perspective on suffering. Right? So being able to look at it instead, to hold it with mindfulness, with spacious awareness. Self-compassion says, be kind to yourself when you suffer. So they go hand in hand, right? I think you need the mindfulness to be able to turn on the red light that says, wait, stop, hang on. Let me use my natural capacity for mindfulness to take a step back and see what's really going on. And then self-compassion allows you to then explore what's going on in your inner landscape and to look for opportunities to, instead of beating yourself up, as we tend to be able to change that habit and instead treat ourselves as we would good friends.
I actually have a funny little story.
Oh, good. I need a funny story.
That illustrates that perfectly. And the tragedy was my book for this class.
Oh.
I have a 1-year-old lab. And I got home from a very, very stressful week and went into my living room, and there were shreds of paper all over my living room. And there was the puppy. And I picked it up and I went, you ate my compassion book. And then I proceeded, it just went boom. And I took the book and I smacked her on the nose with it. And then I caught myself and went, oh, Christine, you're beating the dog with a compassion dog? And I thought, all right, life is out of control. And then I immediately went to, you're beating a dog with a compassion dog? You beast. And it took me a minute to calm down. I looked at the whole situation. She's looking at me like,
What the?
I'm sorry. And I thought, all right, you need to put the brakes on everything, evaluate. Okay, you clearly need a break. The dog clearly needs the exercise. So then my foster son said, you should get another book. And I said, oh no, I should keep this.
There you go.
This is my reminder. But it was that moment of, I lost control. Then I was immediately mindful as I like went for the second stroke, put the book on her nose and went, oh gosh, it's like something out of this. Put it down, and then it was like seconds. But I think if we can practice being mindful, we might not catch it before it happens, but at least we can regroup,
Right,
and then
faster.
stop, and then be kind to ourselves. But it's like I'm clinging to my book as a reminder, like,
Such a good story.
it's all good. Let go of just all of it. But I think it shows that progression.
Yeah, no,
that we
perfectly.
need to
And
be
you
aware
cut
of.
yourself very fast, right? And you didn't beat yourself up about it.
For
Right?
a split second.
Just a
And
split
then I realized, no, there's
Yeah,
be mindful again.
Yeah,
Evaluate.
let it go.
There's too much
Lessons
going on.
learned. Yeah,
Stop.
exactly.
Yeah.
You're perfect.
So,
I can totally relate to
I had to share it. It was like the perfect little scenario.
that. Passion book. Yeah. Anything else to share on that one? One more point, which I thought this was really, really important. So we have to be really careful in our use of self-compassion, not to use it. I think this is exactly what she wrote, and I want to hear what you guys said. They wrote, in other words, we can't just, when we struggle, we give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. So we have to be careful here. When we struggle, we give ourselves compassion not to feel better, but because we feel bad. In other words, we can't just throw self-compassion at ourselves as a way to make the pain go away. If we do, we're engaging in a form of resistance that will ultimately just make things worse. However, if we can fully accept that things are painful and be kind to ourselves because they are painful, we can be with the pain with greater ease. We need mindfulness to ensure that self-compassion isn't used in the service of resistance, right? We need self-compassion to feel safe and secure enough to mindfully open to difficult experiences. I think what they're saying is that we can't just use self-compassion as a way to maybe avoid a situation, to cover up a situation, to make the pain go away is exactly what they're saying. If we do, we're engaging in a hidden form of resistance that will ultimately just make things worse.
I think I'm hearing a second piece of that.
Yeah.
And that is that unfortunately, it's like when a child falls down, you can't, erase the fact that the child is falling down. So you can comfort the child, say, I'm sorry you fell down, but we fall down.
Yeah.
So there's that two pieces of it. So it's acknowledging that there is pain, but also saying that, not getting caught up in, oh my heavens, you fell down, this is terrible. It's awful. Yes, you fell down, I'm sorry. That's what goes on. In the sense that there's both ideas.
Hold both at the same time. Anything else?
Well, one way embrace this acceptance, and the other way doesn't. If I use that compassion to make myself feel better, like, oh, poor Steve, it was so hard.
Right, if it runs into self-pity, right? They have to be,
or, you know, things are tough and
Yeah.
that's kind of how it goes. And, but, you know, it'll be okay.
yeah,
It's,
exactly.
there's one does not have accepted involved.
Right. I think that's a good way to think about it. Okay. So let's just try this exercise then. The exercise is, how do I cause myself unnecessary suffering? So it says, think of a current situation in your life when you feel that resisting the reality of something painful is causing you unnecessary suffering and may actually be making things worse than they need to be, such as procrastinating on a big project, resenting something about your current job, harboring anger toward your neighbor's barking dog. Not my dog. Oh no. And then you can write it down or just think it through. So I'll read it one more time. Think of a current situation in your life when you feel that resisting the reality of something painful is causing you unnecessary suffering and may actually be making things worse than they need to be. Boy, no shortage of those situations. Everybody got some? Okay, the next thing. How do you know that you are resisting? Is there any discomfort in the body or the mind? And try to describe it to yourself. What are the consequences of resisting? For example, how might your life be easier if you stopped resisting or at least resisted a little less? Okay, the last two questions. Can you see that resistance might be serving you in some way? Perhaps resistance is helping you not to feel certain feelings that could be overwhelming. If difficult feelings arise, be kind to yourself. Honor your resistance, knowing that sometimes it allows you to function in the world. And then finally, consider how mindfulness or self-compassion might help lessen your resistance in this situation. Might validating the pain, like thinking this is tough, it is difficult, and letting it into your life, opening the hand of fear, make things easier or more difficult. Or would offering yourself a little understanding, it's not your fault. Or remembering common humanity, this is how people feel in these situations, bring some relief. So validating the pain, or offering yourself understanding, and so forth. Would that help lessen your resistance in that particular situation? Any comments? Anything you'd like to share based on that meditation?
The whole concept of honoring our resistance, because it helps us function, it may help us function in life. I had a hard time with that. I mean, isn't that kind of like a state borrowing from the pension fund? Eventually you have to pay it. So are you really, I mean, you're functioning now, but doesn't it, if you do it that way, aren't you going to pay more? Or it'll be harder to function in life by honoring and understanding that this is the way you're getting by? So is that
I
really,
think, well, so the sentence before it was perhaps resistance is helping you not to feel certain feelings that could be overwhelming. Maybe I took it to mean that maybe like right now, it's so painful that
you
have
can't
to
deal with it?
Yeah, so you just
But maybe
"Oh, it's
later
fine."
on you might be able to?
might be stronger or have the resources necessary to open that door. I don't know. Anybody else?
About that comment, like for me, that one stood out because the situation I was thinking of was a coworker who walked out at work. And I was very close to that person and it happened in the moment. And I felt like I might cry or something if I was too emotional saying goodbye. So I think that I felt bad that I told him after work later, like I couldn't be really friendly at that time because I was going to cry. So it gave me the ability to behave like was expected in the situation. I mean, that's how I
I
interpret
think I
it.
understand what you're saying.
Okay.
I think sometimes resistance could not quite be resistance, but an important stop sign.
Okay.
Okay. Is this the same chaos you've known in the past? Are you going recognizing the cause? Maybe it's just an old habit, and stop it and try something new. And if that brings up fear, okay, but stop. And then what could come up for me is, well, what fear, what's going to happen if I stop? But then just do it, because you didn't stop in the past. I don't know if I'm being confusing. I also have fear of even expressing all these thoughts that are swirling in my head even right now. And so I was in a situation where I knew it was as a young child, I was super shy and resistant to speaking up.
Oh, okay.
And the worst when I was a kid was having a teacher who would pick on me if I didn't raise my hand. Oh, I could still feel the fears, and then the words that have been said to me. Wow, you got fear, you got to be strong, you just got to do it, and
got to be
but
tough.
it felt. And usually in the past, way past, I would just force myself to do a number of things that I didn't want to do. But this stop sign that could be positive is being in a place, someone's a good person, not being angry, get past the anger, because it's an old anger from, may not be being clear, I think I'm rambling on. Okay, you used to feel this way in reaction to this kind of person speaking this way. Even if you're not sure, try and act differently. In the past, you said, forge ahead. Okay, let's try just saying no. I'm going to do something different.
So you're using the mindfulness to maybe sense when that resistance is coming, and to change the way that you would otherwise have reacted in the past.
In the past, and then because I never said no. Try saying no right now. I just want to listen and say it's not out of weakness. It's what you want, and then feeling the victory that. Okay, sometimes you feel like talking and other times no. And to politely express that.
Like resistance provides an opportunity?
A bit, because at least I didn't have, if I was caught up in chaos, it's well, maybe a stop sign, but maybe that's mindfulness and not really resistance.
Mindfulness, sensing that the resistance is arising and using that as an opportunity for change.
I was thinking about it too as resistance and avoidance paired with the mindfulness, our opportunities, right? Like as I was listening, I was thinking that, and it was similar to what Christine was saying, catching yourself. It's opportunities if we're able to bring mindfulness to feeling resistant, to not accepting, to avoiding. It gives us a chance to rewrite the way we then feel about it.
Rewrite history. Don't let it repeat itself.
That's tough stuff.
Redefine it. Well, create a better future.
Can I ask you a question about that? I was listening to you, and it very much resonated with me, because I totally understand that whole thing that happens. But someone told me like 10 years ago, and it's worked magic for me. I mean, I'm believe me, still struggling with a lot of this, but they said just inject time. So rather than thinking I'm putting a stop sign, I just think, okay, this is when I get a little crazy, and I practice it at the holidays with my family, so they say something that I don't like. And I just tell myself, inject time. I can get back to them about that later, but, and the stuff that you realize later that you don't really care about just goes away. And if there's something that you really do need to address, you can do it like after you've digested everything.
I'll slow down.
Describing as a stop sign, just be quiet, time.
Okay, same
Time
thing.
sounds a little gentler to me.
Yeah.
And it makes it easier because you can still in the back of your mind say, I still can if I want to, you know, but so I think that time it does help me, you know. Is that resistant though? Is if you're, I don't know.
Skillful.
Yeah, this was a wise
Skillful.
person that told me this.
There's an underlying, there too, there's an underlying theme for me, which is, we need to do this correctly.
Better,
Yeah.
better.
Right. Being more kind and patient with ourselves, and then we can become more kind and patient with those around us. Okay. And so they suggest that, so for the next week, this is your homework. Just try to be aware of any small moments when you're resisting something unpleasant, like you don't want to go to the DMV and register your car or whatever it is. So when you notice resistance is occurring, simply use a neutral, matter-of-fact tone or voice to label it, like resistance. I'm experiencing a moment of resistance. So just even being able to identify that feeling as it arises, that kind of annoying, nagging feeling.
Annoying and nagging, see resistance, and then pulling into another kind of resistance. Like saying, oh, I gotta stop, I'm resisting, and then just
Starting the negative.
Yeah, and start falling into, okay, just give myself a break.
Right.
Maybe the break is just an escape. I know that I can get caught in that.
Right.
How to be neutral.
Tailspin.
But I guess practicing mindfulness.
Well, yeah. So you're taking it a step further. Here we're just noticing the resisting, right?
Just notice.
Just notice. I guess the idea is that a lot of times it's difficult to even identify those moments of resistance. And once we can identify them, then using the mindfulness, using what we learned about self-compassion, and just sitting with those moments of resistance, then we can address them. Right?
You gotta sit longer.
Yeah.
I've been witnessing for all my life.
Yeah. Well, I guess.
Maybe I'd inject a little more self-compassion.
Yeah.
So sometimes I think resisting is positive if you just pause and then think of your intention, and maybe it allows you to come from a more sacred place of your heart as opposed to what you really feel that you should be doing. Because I think a lot of, at least in my case, some of my actions are driven by what I feel I should do based on what I think maybe other people want me to do as opposed to what I really
Truly feel.
authentically feel.
Yeah.
And if I resist my initial reaction, then I have a better chance of being more
Authentic.
authentic.
Beautiful.
But if I just go and don't resist at all, it's not me.
Yeah. It's almost like a filter.
It's a matter of importance of what is me, identifying the self, what I really want. I mean, is it okay in that pause to just go watch a movie? Sometimes I'll judge that. Maybe I should be reading a few more books, like running around, whatever. That would be more helpful. And instead, I'm watching 3 movies. Is that okay? Is that pause? Or is that just
Throwing self-compassion to me over.
I really want.
Yeah. what do you want versus what do you need?
Oh,
What's really
that's
curative, right? What's really healing?
Yeah.
That's what's hard to for us to sort through, right?
Mm.
Do I really need to sit around and watch little funny dodo movies on Facebook? Like, just like saving this dog, saving that dog, saving that elephant. Like, how many movies do I need to watch with the elephant stuck in the trench? Is it helpful? I don't know. Yeah. It's just sentimentality, but I don't know. Should we be out there? Yeah, we're out there looking for stray cats to rescue in the woods. Huh?
Just earlier, you were the one that brought up we shouldn't shoot on ourselves.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And I
Yeah,
think
that's
you
coming
have the
back.
idea, but maybe you need a little break to be able to go back.
Watch the dodo movies
Watch the
too.
movie per se, but maybe that's your down, quiet, insular time.
Yeah.
Mine's splitting wood.
Oh, come on down. I got good.
Put the shit on it and then I overcompensate by taking 3 compassion courses all in 1 week. And
Yeah, slow
doing
down.
meditation and radical compassion plus. When I can still just need to choose one.
Yeah. I think you're right. Yeah, just slow down. Take it easy.
Even if it takes a movie.
There you go.
Sometimes it's different for different people, I think. You know, sometimes we need to take that stop and let the noise stop for a minute. All that noise that we have to live with every day in our own heads, in the world, and just go, I need a break. Because, you know, if you don't take care of the car, it will break down at the worst time. If you don't take care of your head and heart, they'll break down at the worst time.
Yeah. So let's move it on in the book. Actually, the next chapter talks more about different approaches to put compassion into action. So the first part of the book was more, kind of assessing and examining and explaining the way the mind works. And the second part is training our mind and heart. That's more kind of ways to put all of this into practice. It's more solution oriented, I think. And so the first chapter in part 2 talks about, it's called From Compassion to Action, turning intention into motivation, which I think is a little confusing. But it centers around the prayer, that's the prayer of the 4 immeasurables, which is the prayer that we actually usually say in the beginning of this class, but I forgot. So the prayer is, and you have a copy in front of you. So I'll just read it from here instead of, if you're following along in the book, it's on page 69. Same prayer, slightly different wording. And the order is a little bit different. But anyway, how wonderful it would be if all living beings were to abide in equanimity, free from attachment and hatred. May they abide in that way. I shall cause them to abide in that way. Please bless me to be able to do so. How wonderful it would be if all living beings had happiness and its causes. May they have those. I shall cause them to have those. Please bless me to be able to do so. How wonderful it would be if all living beings were free from suffering and its causes. May they be free. I shall cause them to be free. Please bless me to be able to do so. How wonderful it would be if all living beings were never parted from fortune and the supreme bliss of liberation. May they never be parted. I shall cause them never to be parted. Please bless me to be able to do so. So, just Thupten Jinpa gives a short commentary on this explanation of this prayer. So the first, I gotta get this right. May all beings be free from suffering and its causes. So in our prayer book, that's actually the third verse. Its order is slightly different, right? May all beings be free from suffering and its causes. The second verse, how wonderful it would be if all living beings had happiness and its causes. So that's loving kindness. And then the last verse is how wonderful it would be if all living beings were never parted from, here it's translated as fortune and the supreme bliss of liberation. But it's also translated perhaps in the vernacular, a little bit more easy to understand. Well, a slightly different emphasis. May all beings never be separated from joy that is free of misery. So in that sense, it is the wish that all beings have sympathetic joy, have joy, okay, have joy. So why is it translated as fortune and supreme bliss of liberation? It's the same idea, but at a different level, from a different perspective. You're thinking that may everybody be free from suffering. May they all attain the joy of liberation from samsara, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. Otherwise, you can think of it as just joy. And then equanimity, which in this case is the first verse, and it's translated in the book as, may all beings abide in equanimity, free from the bias of attachment and aversion. So on one level, it's just saying that equanimity means staying calm no matter what life throws at us, whether it's pleasure and pain, likes and dislikes, success and failure, praise, blame, fame, and disrepute, which are like the 8 worldly dharmas, if you're studying Buddhist texts. And it lets us relate to everyone as human beings. So this is the most important part, right? So equanimity means not discriminating between friends and foes, right? Friends and enemies. Everybody is held with equal respect, with equal regard, with equal loving kindness and compassion, okay? So we're free of the habitual forces of expectations and apprehensions that make us so vulnerable to over-excitation and disappointment. So we're ultimately, it means that, we're free of the ignorance, we're free of attachment, we're free of hatred, we're free of the delusions, we're free of the tendency to project, labels both onto ourselves as well as onto other people. And that tendency to label things based from a self-centered perspective on the universe, that's what then generates, these expectations, that generates fear, that generates disappointment, that generates all of the problems that we've been talking about, right? Okay. So equanimity. May all beings abide in equanimity, free from the bias of attachment and aversion. All right, so those are the root versions. So then he points out, I thought this was neat. He talks about the mental states that are countered, that are overcome by each of these immeasurables. So for compassion, the opposite of compassion is cruelty. So wishing to do harm instead of wishing to alleviate suffering, it would be causing harm, so cruelty. For loving kindness, the opposite is ill will or harmful intent. For sympathetic joy, the opposite would be, instead of wishing, somebody to be free of, full of joy and happy, it's envy or jealousy, so wishing the opposite, wanting to have their joy, right? Feeling jealous that they have a joy that you don't have, right? So not being able to feel, experience the joy that somebody else is feeling. So if somebody else gets that job promotion that you wanted, instead feeling jealous and thinking that they didn't deserve it as much as you did, right? Okay. So then he says that there are also, at a more subtle level, there are other close cousins of these four immeasurables. So for loving kindness, he talks about how loving kindness's near enemy is selfish affection or attachment. That's when we love someone for what we think they can give us, right? So that's not true loving kindness. That instead is like this selfish reason, right? The ulterior motive, that's what I was trying to think of. Ulterior motive is I love you, but only because, you know, like if you have a nice little doggy, the doggy only loves you because you'll feed it and groom it and take it for a nice dog walk. That's not really true, but anyway. Sympathetic joy's near enemy is frivolous joy, which grasps at pleasant but meaningless experiences. Equanimity's near enemy is indifference or apathy. And compassion's near enemy is, what do you think? What would compassion's near enemy be? It's not genuine compassion. It's, did you say it?
Indifference and cruelty.
Well, okay, but pity. Yeah. So that was the more extreme example, and then at a more subtle level, it's pity, right? So what's wrong with pity? Because it implies
That they're inferior.
yeah, a sense of superiority, right? Yeah. So exactly. Pity implies a sense of superiority. So unlike compassion, which connects us based on a sense of equality, right, of commonality, common humanity, that's compassion, we're respecting the other just as we respect ourselves, then pity is very dangerous because you're holding the other person, you know, at a distance by saying, oh, you know, you're inferior to me. And so I condescendingly feel that I should take care of it. So it goes back to this idea, the discussion that we had about, valuing, right? So before we were talking about self-esteem and self-worth and how that's all wrapped up into this sense of how we are valued. We don't value ourselves in a vacuum, but rather we value ourselves in the context of our community, right? We compare ourselves to others and then we have a sense of value, right? So compassion includes respect and even like, you know, sympathy. Sympathy implies respecting the other person as an equal, right? Sympathy is heart to heart. And so it's only like pity. Pity is where there's a sense of one person being of higher value, better than average than the other person, right? Okay. And so when we usually, when we do this meditation, then we start by connecting with our own experience. And then, so we generate, you know, each of these four qualities implicitly, you know, we might not explicitly say it, but implicitly, you know, we generate loving kindness, compassion, a sense of joy, rejoicing in the good that, you know, we've done, and cultivate that sense of equanimity. It applies to ourselves first, right? And then you broaden the horizon, broaden the circle, widen the circle, and you bring in not just, you know, friends and family, but also strangers, and then moving on to people who, beings that are causing disruption and are a little bit more challenging. Okay. So that's the way that prayer is used. So then we're going to talk about setting the intention. So there's a discussion about compassion. I'm sorry, excuse me. motivation and intention, which I guess maybe it's a little bit just like splitting hairs. Maybe it's a little academic, but it's interesting. And I think it comes down to, although it's not explicitly said initially in this chapter, it all comes down to values, right? So really based on our values, what we think of as important, then we set our motivation, and the motivation then relates to our intention, which is then related to our actions, to our behavior, right? And so he talks about motivation as, I guess there are different ways in which these terms can be defined, but motivation is like the reason why we do something, the underlying reason why we decide to come to, this Sunday morning class. What was your motivation, right? You were seeking something. That was the motivation. So for like in dog training, right, we talk a lot about whether or not you assess the dog's behavior, dog's personality. Right? And so at any given time that could change, of course, but some dogs will say, oh, they're really treat motivated. They'll work for a treat. You can train them based on treats. Other dogs, that doesn't work. It has to be, toys. They're very toy oriented, toy motivated. Okay, so in terms of our motivation, so we're driven by the quest for personal happiness. Right? So what motivates us is that desire to be happy, to be free from suffering. Some of us are more motivated by what we were talking about before, by what's commonly known as the 8 worldly dharmas. But some people are very driven by self-image, right? Or it could be the desire for material possessions. It could be praise, and the like. And then intention implies like a conscious decision, right? So my overall sense of motivation is to be a good person, to be a compassionate person, right? And so then my intention, how do I actually intend to, or how do I act on? Well, that's probably not right. How do I intend to fulfill that urge, right? That need to develop compassion? Well, I'll come to the Dharma Center. Or even bigger than that, I intend to become a Buddha, to become a fully enlightened Buddha, in order to perfect my human potential, right? And so in order to do that, then I behave and act and think in specific ways. Or, you may have the compassionate wish to help like homeless people, right? So the many different ways, that you can do that, right? So you can collect coats as part of our coat drive, hint, hint. Or I saw of course on Facebook, this is all I do is just watch Facebook, it's very sad. But there was a group of barbers, somewhere on the West Coast probably. And so they got together and they did makeovers, extensive makeovers for homeless people, and helped them. They bought them new clothes, they helped them find jobs. They, of course, made them look fantastic, right? They all came out looking like movie stars. So that was their way of trying to do something for that community. So whatever we can do on a day-to-day basis is a way of being able to take the values that are important to us and then shaping that into carrying it through to our motivation, expressing this motivation through specific intentional actions, and in that way causing being an agent for change. All right, so So this final exercise, we only have 5 minutes, but that's okay. We'll just do this quickly, and then when you go home, I guess my point in doing these exercises is that you could spend all day on each one of them, but we'll just do them quickly, and then if you have the book, or maybe you just remember the exercises, then when you go home, you can spend more time on it. So here the idea is just to set our intention. This is something that you can do first thing in the morning. You can do it wherever you are, wherever is convenient for you. You can do it while you're driving. You can do it throughout the course of the day. Actually, it's good to go back and check on what your intention is. So just sit comfortably. Come back to the breath for a few minutes. Allowing your body to soften and relax. Or wake up if you've been falling asleep. So then reflect on the following questions. What is it that I value deeply? What in the depth of my heart do I wish for myself, for my loved ones, and for the world? Stay with these questions a little and see if any answers come up. If no specific answers surface, then don't worry. Simply stay open with the questions. Trust that the questions themselves are working, even if we don't have ready answers. If and when answers do come up, acknowledge them as they arise, and stay with whatever thoughts and feelings they may bring. Finally, develop a specific set of thoughts as your conscious intention, perhaps for this day. For example, you could think, today, may I be more mindful in my body, mind, and speech, in my interaction with others. May I relate to myself with kindness and understanding and less aggression. And then dedicating our experience. So the intention is something that you generate as a wish. And then the dedication goes along or supports the intention that you set. And it's a way to go back and reflect on whether or not the intention that you created was indeed fulfilled. And so it's an opportunity to go back and rejoice if the intention was carried out. And if not, if things didn't work out, then simply to acknowledge that that was the case and let it go. So think for a moment, we can dedicate all of the merit that we created by coming together today, based on whatever your motivation and intention was for coming. Dedicate all of that merit. Rejoice in the fact that you acted, that you came to class today. May that be a benefit. So he suggests that you do the dedication reflection at the end of the day, just before you go to bed. Think about how the day went. All right. So I guess we have class next week. Yeah, we do. Then we'll finish up chapter 4 and move on to chapter 5, which is kind of more meditation oriented, how to do different types of mindfulness meditation to help us be more self-aware. So that's chapter 5, making way for compassion. All right. Thank you so much for coming. Have a good week.
It's just this here. We were close with Persia's teacher. And
She told us about this.
Yeah, I was just thinking of,
And I went,
the pretty
you look
good.
into that.
Yeah, I know. He brought it up the day before, and he said she was tired, and then this weekend.
Yeah,
and mom-
it's wild.
Oh, he's still around.
I have to
Yeah,
go
he's
from
here.
them, both in their early 20s.
No.
Yeah, so they're not at home, so it's just he and I at home.
That is so
Yeah.
and I can't believe that he's like, he's so quiet.
Yeah.
I
I try to get him out on the weekend.
Yeah.
Usually can't Wednesday meditation with me.
Right here?
Imagine how many
How's that
hours
working?
Oh, good. It's a little
I
easier
think
to
they
get him
came
up and
back.
going
I wish
Wednesday
I had a
night.
bigger house.
He likes to.
No, I mean, how's it going?
My schedule's always. Short term.
They do. They do. They take short. They take people specifically for the residents. So if there's an emergency, the child has to be.
I know, I checked Rose yesterday, I dragged him out and he walked her.
If it's a big one, you would contact.
Yeah. Cause I really
I will. I will. Let you know right now. It's an
I usually
incredibly
do,
invasive
long island
procedure.
Oh,
Because
no,
about
they
the
go.
stuff they ask you.
And it's like that, but I'm sure they come to their house and do all.
Oh,
of
yeah.
this. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
But you know what? That gives passion to people, you know, because.
I had to figure that out on Saturday and I feel more now.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.